We're in the 12th chapter of Mark, and the setting is 3 days before Jesus' death. He's in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was dominated, the landscape was dominated by a huge temple complex. And it became, unfortunately, quite a common marketplace. And Jesus did not like that. It made him upset. And so the day before the setting of this story, Jesus, of course, goes into the temple area. He got violent for the first time in his ministry, but his violence was limited to the furniture that they were using to make money in a holy place. He disrupted the businesses that were there. He caused quite a scene. And then the next day, the day of our setting, and it's a Tuesday, it's March 31st, the year AD 33, a group of religious leaders come to him, and they are the chief priests, the scribes, and the town elders. And they come to question Jesus. By whose authority were you able to do all these things in the temple? I mean, who gave you the right? And the reason those groups came, it was because they were primarily concerned with the temple and its dealings and its businesses. They wanted everything to go on as planned. And here comes Jesus, this itinerant prophet in their mind, coming in and tearing everything up, disrupting all of the worship, what they called worship, but really was not worship of God. It was the businesses and the money-making that went on. And so they questioned Jesus. And of course, he questioned them back. He said, well, let me ask you a question. By whose authority did John the Baptist baptize people? Was that from God or from man? And they refused to answer because they were stuck. There wasn't a good answer for them. And so they said, we don't know. And he said, well, I won't tell you by whose authority I do this either. And then Jesus went on and told them 3 parables. Each parable had a successive lesson built upon the last. He told them the first parable, and the lesson was that Israel has failed to believe God. They become unbelieving Israel. The second parable basically said that unbelieving Israel will be replaced by a people who have faith. And the third lesson was even more convicting. In the third parable, Jesus essentially said that unbelieving Israel will be judged. And he hinted that God would destroy Jerusalem. And so they went away, that group went away, and here comes another. A second group comes to question Jesus, and we're in Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. We read, then they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. Who are the Pharisees and who are the Herodians? The Pharisees were a party, a group, a fellowship of very strict, observant Jews, Orthodox Jews, if you will, many of whom were rabbis. And they had a lot of very distinct beliefs, a certain way of reading the Old Testament, what they would call the Hebrew Scriptures. But one of their distinctives was this: they did not like Rome running Jerusalem. Rome had overtaken Jerusalem many years before, and they were the ruling group, the ruling country. And the Pharisees did not like Rome running Jerusalem. Then you have the Herodians. The Herodians were a political party. They loved politics. And if you love politics, what do? You cozy up to the people in power. And that's what the Herodians were. They were people who cozied up to Herod's family. Remember King Herod and all of his the rest of his family? They still ran Jerusalem, Judea, all of that area. And this political party of Jews cozied up to him because they liked to schmooze and kiss the ring and all that stuff. And so it's quite an unusual group that's coming to Jesus, because these two groups, the Pharisees that don't like Rome and the Herodians who are okay with it, they get together. Why? Because they have a common problem. The common problem is this Jesus fellow who's disrupting things. And so they need to get this Jesus fellow out of the way. So they come to Jesus, verse 14, and they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth." This is false flattery. Jesus sees through it. And here's the question: is it lawful to pay a tax to Caesar the leader of Rome, or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? That's the question. Should we pay what was called the poll tax? This tax was created 27 years earlier in the year 86, and it was imposed upon the citizens of Jerusalem. You see, they had, back in that day, the same problem we have today, the government. And the attitude of the government back then was the same as it is today. If it moves, breathes, does something, does nothing, lives or dies, tax it. And so that's what the Roman government did. And so they imposed this poll tax. Should we pay Caesar or not? Now here's the trick. Here's the problem for Jesus. If he says, yes, pay the tax, well, then he's a traitor. Then he's supporting this outside entity that's running Jerusalem. But if Jesus says, no, don't pay the tax. Oh, thank you for saying that out loud, Jesus. Now we're going to turn you in for sedition. And you're going to be in trouble with the Roman government. So it's a trick question. You know, as Admiral Akbar once said, it's a trap. Look out. Jesus, though, verse 15, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at. And they brought one. Here on the screen is an image of the kind of coin they brought to Jesus. You have heads and tails just like today. And this coin would be the equivalent of about $10 today. On one side was an image and likeness of the emperor at the time, Tiberius. On the other side was an image of Livia. Who's Livia? It's Tiberius's mama. And she is dressed up, she's depicted as Pax, which is the female Roman deity for peace. And so the words on these coins, the words on the front of the coin, are an abbreviation for Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus. Tiberius's daddy, Augustus, was the first Roman emperor to be deified by the people and worshipped as a god. And now he has taken the throne, he's imprinting this money, and he's letting everyone else know, my daddy was a god, and so am I. The words on the back side of the coin was an abbreviation of Pontifex Maximus, which means head priest, meaning the emperor is the head priest of the Roman religion. And so this is the coin that they brought to Jesus. Jesus presumably held up this coin, the face showing to them, and he asked them this question, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were amazed at him. So Jesus is teaching, give Caesar, give the government, that which has Caesar's image. Money, taxes, it's okay to pay that. But Jesus said also, give God the things that are God's. So, think about it. If Caesar is owed whatever has Caesar's image, then God is owed whatever has God's image. Do you know what has the image of God? It's you. You are the image of God. That does not mean you are God, you are far from it. But you have His image. His image is imprinted upon you indelibly. That means that you owe God you. You owe Him your very life. You owe Him your everything. Do not fight against Him. Do not resist Him. Do not run away from Him. Give yourself to Him. So, if you had these two groups on this Tuesday coming up to Jesus, the scribes and the chief priests and the town elders. They're all concerned about Jesus disrupting the temple. Then you have the Herodians and the Pharisees, and Jesus has silenced both groups. Well, now, of course, there's going to be another group. Here comes group number 3, verse 18. Then some Sadducees, who, by the way, say there's no resurrection. And that comes into play in this. They came to Jesus and began questioning him. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves behind a wife and leaves no child, his brother should marry the wife and raise up a seed for his brother. What in the world are they talking about? Well, it was a law that God gave Israel because God had given Israel and its 12 tribes particular lands. Each tribe had its own land. And if your family was part of a certain tribe, then you would have some land. You'd have the right to some land within that tribe. And so that land would be passed on to your heir, to your descendants after you. But if you have no heir, you have no child, then your inheritance, and as well as obviously your family, ends with you. And so God provided a way for your family and inheritance to continue in your name, even if you died childless. What would happen is your brother would take your wife as his own and produce an heir, and the heir, that child, would not carry the brother's name, he would carry your name. And by the way, the wife's personal safety and welfare, this wife who's now a widow. And back then, it was not easy for women to get well-paying jobs, good-paying jobs. And so she would have her own personal safety, her welfare taken care of, which was good for her. So that's the law, that's the reasoning behind this fictitious scenario the Sadducees propose, which is this. There were 7 brothers, and the first married a wife and died, leaving no seed. And the second one married her and died, leaving behind no seed. And the third likewise. And so all 7 left no seed. Last of all, this poor, worn-out woman died also. In the resurrection, when they rise again, whose wife will she be? For all 7 had married her. Now remember, this is the group that does not believe that there will be a resurrection. Once you die, it's over, that's it. You can't be raised from the dead. God can't do it. That's their attitude. And so they have no interest in getting a true answer to this question. They're just trying to stump Jesus. And Jesus said to them in verse 24, "Is this not the reason you're mistaken? That you do not understand the Scriptures, nor the power of God?" Jesus is saying, you guys don't understand the Hebrew Scriptures, because the Hebrew Scriptures clearly teach that there will be a resurrection. Nor do you guys believe that God can do it. You guys think that death is more powerful than God, and it's not. And so Jesus calls them out on both of those. And then he says, "For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Let's talk about this for a minute, because it's been the source of some confusion. What's that mean? They'll be like angels in heaven. Well, in Luke's version of this story, he adds a little bit more of what Jesus said that Mark leaves out. Let's see what Luke says. He says, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they cannot even die anymore, because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection." Jesus clearly explains in Luke's gospel what he means when he says they will be like angels. He simply means they are immortal. When you're resurrected from the dead and you're given a glorified body, you cannot die. That's going to be an incredible experience for us. Your body will be immortal. And so Jesus is clearly teaching this. Cool. But what does that have to do with marriage? Well, Perhaps it means, the most common explanation is that it means that marriage no longer exists in heaven. That when you or your spouse dies, the marriage is completely over. And so even though you might be married here in this life, when you're resurrected from the dead and your spouse is resurrected from the dead, you will no longer be known together as husband and wife. I guess you'll be friends. I hope you'll be friends. Why? Because the life of the resurrection is undying, and there's no need for the natural functions of the male and the female. In other words, there's no need to propagate the human race anymore with people that will outlive you after you die. Why? Because you're not going to die. And so theoretically, if there's no marriage in heaven, then there's no marital activity in heaven, the kind that creates tax deductions. There's none of that. And so that's the most common explanation, the most common interpretation. There is another one that I find at least interesting. Because if you read it carefully, Jesus says that people won't get married in the resurrection. He doesn't specifically say that marriage doesn't exist in heaven, although we might presume that that's what he means. But the wording says they neither marry. Who is it that marries? It's the groom. When a young man takes a wife, he is the one who marries. And who is it that is given in marriage? It's the bride. She is the one that's given by her father or older relative to the groom in marriage. And so Jesus specifically is saying that there is no process for getting married in the age to come. Now, if this interpretation is correct, then it would mean this, that Jesus is saying that no new marriages will be initiated in the resurrection. This is not quite the same as saying that existing God-ordained marriages will disappear. And if that's the case, then the only marriages that would exist in the resurrection are those marriages that were based on God's desire for Adam to have a covenant partner for life, not marriages that the Sadducees raised, which were based upon a brother's death, because there's no more death. So, which one's correct? Will there be marriages in the resurrection? You'll have to wait and find out. I don't know. But these pesky Sadducees don't even believe in the resurrection, and so Jesus settles the issue for them. He says, but regarding the fact that the dead are raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the burning bush, that's Exodus 3, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You're greatly mistaken. Let me show you what Jesus is talking about. In the year 1991 BC, Abraham died. We read about that in Genesis 25. 545 years later, in the year 1446 BC, God tells Moses at the burning bush incident, I am, present tense, the God of Abraham. What does that imply? It implies that Abraham still exists, even after he died. If Abraham's death caused Abraham to cease to exist, then God would have told Moses, I was the God of Abraham back then. But since Abraham no longer exists, I can't say that I am the God of Abraham. But that's not what God said. God said, I am the God of Abraham. The reason Abraham continues to exist even after he died is so that he will be raised from the dead someday. And by the way, that's why you continue to exist after you die as a believer. Jesus proves the resurrection is a reality because God used a present tense verb instead of a past tense verb. Jesus believed that God had so inspired the Scriptures so precisely that even the tenses of the verbs are the Word of God and have great implications. And Jesus says he is not God of the dead, but of the living. He tells the Sadducees, you are greatly mistaken. So Jesus has thoroughly defeated every religious group that in their own way is leading people away from God instead of toward God. And that is the problem that Jesus has with these groups. They're not leading people to worship God. With all of their rules and regulations, with their hypocrisy and their power struggles and everything else, people are turned off. They're being led away from God. And even if someone were to strive to know God, they would probably not be able to find God because of the false teachings and the hypocrisy of these groups. But then Jesus encounters a scribe who may have sincerely been seeking after God. Perhaps this scribe saw something in Jesus that moved him, which was the truth. In verse 28, and when one of the scribes came and heard them arguing, he recognized that Jesus had answered them well and asked him, what commandment is the foremost of all? Jesus answered, the foremost is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Got it? Love God first, love people second. Pretty simple. It sums up the entire Old Testament. And the scribe replied, the scribe said to him, right, teacher, you have truly stated that he is one, and there is no one else beside him. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as himself is much more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he had answered thoughtfully, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. After that, no one would dare to ask him any more questions. Everyone realized that they are not in Jesus' league. This was the last time that anyone publicly argued with Jesus or questioned his authority. Jesus had won every single debate. However, he was not finished with them, not by a long shot. Now Jesus has a single, solitary question for them. And Jesus began to say, as he taught in the temple, how is it that the scribes say that the Christ, the Messiah, is the son or descendant of David? David himself said in the Holy Spirit, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. David himself calls him Lord. So in what sense is he David's son? Everyone agreed that the Christ, the Messiah, would be a descendant or a son of King David who lived 1,000 years before. And they were waiting for the Messiah to show up. And everyone agreed that Psalm 110, which was written by King David, is itself a prophecy about the Messiah. And that is what Jesus is quoting here in verse 1 of Psalm 110. You see that Psalm 110 begins of David. It means David wrote it, a psalm. And here's the way it reads in Psalms. Yahweh, that's God himself, says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool for your feet. So in Psalm 110, verse 1, Yahweh God, the God of Israel, is appointing David's Lord or Master to the very right hand of God himself. But if the Messiah is David's descendant, how can the Messiah be greater than David himself? How can a descendant of King David be greater than David? Because a father has authority over a son. A father has authority over his descendants. So how can a descendant of David have authority over David? That's the question that Jesus is asking. And there's only one possibility. The only possibility is that the descendant or the son of David must simultaneously be the Son of God. And only one person fits that bill, and it's Jesus. Verse 37, and the large crowd enjoyed listening to him, but Jesus had more to say. Verse 38, he wasn't finished. And in his teaching, he was saying, beware of the scribes who want to walk around in long robes, who want respectful greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. What's Jesus talking about? They devour widows' houses. What happened in that day was this. Oftentimes, if a woman was made a widow, if her husband had passed away and he had some property or he had a business and she didn't know how to manage the property or business, she would seek out a trustee and she would hire a trustee. And she would look for the kind of trustee that obviously would be righteous, a good man, a righteous man, a pious man. And so, knowing this, there were certain scribes who would put on their longest and best robes, and they would prance around, walking around, because these long robes made them look more religious. And they were deemed pious by other people. They would get their friends to put on a show of giving them respectful greetings when they were out in the marketplace, so that everyone would see just how righteous, how pious these scribes really were. And they made sure that if they could, they would always sit in prominent positions at the synagogue or at banquets so that everyone could see them. But it was all a show. All they were doing was marketing themselves to the widows out there who might be looking for a pious man to be a trustee of their property. And then what would they do after they became a trustee? Would they receive a small recompense for managing the business of the property? No. They would rip off that widow. They would exploit that widow who didn't know any better. And so, for appearance's sake, they offered long prayers out in public just to hook these widows and to get their property. Jesus says, beware of such people. These will receive greater condemnation. And yet there they were, these scribes, in God's holy temple, making a mockery out of the worship of God. And it made Jesus righteously angry. So Jesus is there in the temple. Could he find anybody who is righteous? Is there a remnant of true believers in this sea of hypocrisy? And we read in verse 41. And he sat down opposite the treasury and began observing how the crowd was putting money into the treasury. And many rich people were putting in large sums. You see, at the temple area at that time, in the court of women, where men could be also, but it was the farthest that women could go inside the temple. There in the court of women, on the northern and southern end of the court, there were 13 bronze collection chests. These were called shofars, which means a trumpet, because the top of them looked like a trumpet. And they were completely made of bronze, and the bottom part was a big collection box. And so when the wealthy came by and they deposited their many coins, it made quite a racket. I mean, everyone could hear it. You know how loud coins can be. But the poor widow came, and she put in 2 lepta, which amount to a quadrans. In modern equivalent times, we would say this. She put in 20 cents. That's how much that's worth. She put in 2 dimes. And the noise that it made was obvious to everyone as well. Clink. Clink. And calling his disciples to him, he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all those putting money into the treasury. For they all put in out of their surplus. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she owed, all she had to live on." Why did this poor widow only have 20 cents to her name? Perhaps she was taken advantage of by one of those hypocritical scribes who masqueraded as a pious trustee of her estate. And yet, this poor widow remained faithful to God. The contrast between the sincere faith of the poor widow and the hypocrisy of the religious leaders was striking. I could be wrong. I could be projecting my own feelings about this, but I believe that the scenario made Jesus absolutely livid. And he's not mad at the poor widow. He's mad at the religious leaders that were leading people astray and ripping people off. And as we'll see next week, Jesus lets everyone know it. Today, in your heart of hearts, you may be a sincere follower of the Lord. Imperfect as you are, you sincerely seek to follow the Lord. And I think that's commendable that you've allowed God to do that great work in your life and in your heart. You might be someone that's been searching, looking for God, looking for how can I follow Jesus. I would say that he is simply a prayer away. He is sincere, he is true, he cares about you. And if you've had issues with hypocritical religious leaders, so has Jesus. And he'll deal with them one day. There might even be someone here who is a hypocrite. Now, we're all hypocritical in our own minor way, but I'm talking about someone who puts on an air, who puts on a show, who calls themselves Christian, who makes themselves out to be a good and godly and holy church member, but in your heart of hearts, you're not here to worship God. You're here to make business deals. You're here for other reasons, but it's not about your love for God. Jesus gives you an opportunity to repent and to say yes to him and reject hypocrisy.